important memories of what Project Pegasus achieved. I'd like to do an appearance with him on 60 Minutes or in some other mainstream television news show and talk about what the project achieved. It was actually a great accomplishment of American civilization that we should be taking credit for and telling others about, not concealing as a state secret. The other prominent American politician who was involved was, as I said, Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico. He was about 25 years old, and he was the individual who was essentially doing the head count when we would teleport to Santa Fe in 1970.
Really?
He was there at the state capitol complex, and he had our names first and last. He would do a head count and then take us into the Baton Memorial Building and sit us individually in a room, I think right around now where the Attorney General's office is in New Mexico, there in that building. And there'd be a simple chair with a desk on it there, and we'd walk into the room, and Bill Richardson would sit down in his chair desk, and ask us our name first and last. Sometimes ask us to spell our last name. Obviously, I have a rather unusual one, so I remember doing that. One time I asked him his name, and he said, Bill. And I said, Bill what? And he said, Richardson. So I know it was a young Bill Richardson. He also was very well regarded by the project people, including my dad. In fact, it's sort of hard to describe the culture we were living in. It was one in which a loose network of engineers and scientists, people like my father and William Shockley, or my father and Enrico Fermi. We didn't meet Fermi, but we did meet Emilio Segre. So you had engineers from Parsons and other large process engineering companies. I remember that Bob Beckwith, who had just been working for GE, was one of the project scientists, and he's gone on and acknowledged the existence of, as he calls it, levitated, I believe, teleportation. So you had this loose assemblage of engineers from major process engineering companies, federal scientists, and defense technical personnel, representatives of the Defense Department, and even some New Mexico natives who were the friends and intimates of some of the people on the project, who would be, let's say, having lunch at the La Hacienda restaurant or the La Placida restaurant in Albuquerque and talking about the project, but talking in somewhat of a veiled way so that people at the next table wouldn't know they were talking about. So it was in that context where here we are, rubbing elbows with intelligence operatives at lunch, and people like Don Rumsfeld and my father, who had reporting requirements to the CIA. In fact, during my investigation, working through an intermediary, we contacted the Central Intelligence Agency, and the answer that came back was that they couldn't share information with the family members of a living or deceased CIA personnel. So that was pretty much tantamount to acknowledging that my dad was CIA. So in that context, just socializing with people from different walks of life who were actually in the project, these individuals were reading intelligence reports that synthesized information about future events. So I remember there being chit-chat around the lunch table that, young Bill, the young man who's working as a staffer on the project and doing the head count when the kids pop into view in Santa Fe, he becomes governor. And Ray's son's Andy, he's going to go on and be one of the first people to tell the people of the world the life forms that are on Mars. They were actually laughing about what they knew, because it was information that wouldn't. And I remember them talking about the advent of the Clinton presidency or the internet, and these were like fascinating, coveted secrets they had because somebody would read something in an intelligence report, and then they would share what they knew. So, for example, one time we went into a bar in Albuquerque, and my dad and Don Rumsfeld commiserated about actually being on a federal research project where they were involving children in time travel. And my dad said, about 15 minutes into the discussion, my dad said to Rummy, Rummy, we found out on the program that you make defense secretary. And at this point, Rumsfeld had only been a former congressman and was here on, a secret defense project. And I remember that he said, well, Ray, I saw that in one of the reports, but let me tell you, that's something I'll only believe when it happens. So they were actually in this strange world, almost this alternate reality, if you will, where they were sharing information about the future with each other. And sometimes they were getting it right, and I know sometimes they were getting it wrong. One thing I remember them having difficulty about getting their heads around was what exactly the Internet was. And I remember that John McCone of the CIA was at lunch, and he was trying to explain that the device was something like sitting in front of a TV set with a keyboard like an electric typewriter, and through a connection to a network, you could share written messages with anybody else anywhere in the world. And I remember my dad and some of the other engineers at the table really trying to imagine what the internet was and talking about it. So there were some really hysterical moments when I look back on how they got some things very right and other things they really couldn't comprehend.
Yeah.
But it was in that context that I met George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush during one of those social gatherings with the project principals. And I remember George W. Bush joking to everybody around the tables. We were at 3 tables in this particular restaurant in Albuquerque. He was joking that me and my daddy are going to become president. So they clearly had already been briefed. I remember Bill Clinton being discussed as a future American president. And in the late 80s, when I was questioning my dad about what he knew about my future and the future in general, this was when he was ill shortly before his death in January of 1990, I remember he said that there was going to be an African-American president of the United States, but he couldn't remember his name. He had read it many years earlier. He said it was something like Brick Obanja. So clearly Barack Obama's name appeared in the intelligence reports that Project Pegasus was gathering about future events, namely the Obama presidency. Now, by sheer serendipity, I believe possibly by some form of divine intervention, if we now move 10 years forward in time, when I was an undergraduate at UCLA, I was having a discussion with an anti-apartheid activist on Bruin Walk, which is where all the political pamphleteers hand out their literature on the UCLA campus in Westwood. And I was having a discussion with this man, and I was sharing some of my ideas about political economy, what impact the transnational corporations would have on global development for good or ill. And he said, I have a house guest that I'd like you to meet, so why don't you come by and visit my house in West Los Angeles, and I can introduce you to this person. So I got in his VW bug, and we went over to West Los Angeles, and I met this young, intelligent, articulate man from Columbia University who explained to me that his name was Barack Obama. And he had just transferred to Columbia after attending college at Occidental College in the Pasadena area for a couple of years. And he had done a year at Columbia, he explained, and was back in Los Angeles visiting his friends from his first 2 years of college. So this must have been spring or summer break of 1982. And I had a political discussion with Barack, and it started to become somewhat heated. It was a pretty voluble political discussion in which I was taking a fairly socialist view of corporations, and he was taking a more doctrinaire sort of liberal democratic view of why corporations are necessary and so forth, and more of a legalistic view rather than a social justice view of the corporations. And toward the end of the conversation, we really started to argue, and his friend, the anti-apartheid activist who had invited me over to his house, said, "You better be nice to him, Andy, because he's going to be president of the United States someday." And at that time, immersed in my college years, I certainly wasn't thinking about what I had done as a 10-year-old in a black defense project, a classified research project, defense project. And so we were, ordinary, sarcastic, verbal undergraduates. And so I said something like, "Oh yeah, right, maybe both of us will, pitch, for the teams in the World Series during the, bottom of the ninth in some World Series." And then Barack used that as an excuse to sort of break away from what was this argument that was fomenting between us. And his friend from South Africa said, "No, you don't understand, Andy. We know he's going to be president." So that indicated that Barack Obama had not only been briefed on the fact that he was going to be president, but he was revealing it to principals in his political circles when we weren't even 21 years of age. So that, I think, will help explain why I'm coming forward at this time sort of on the political level regarding Project Pegasus. We're living in a world in which individuals like Barack Obama entered the 2008 presidential election with an inherent advantage. And that advantage was that he knew he was going to win. In fact, he didn't just know it that year, he knew it 27 years previously.